So welcome everyone to today's monthly Human Origins Hot Topic event about humans potentially causing megafaunal extinctions or not. That's what we're going to hear about. So my name is Briana Pobiner, and I am a research scientist and an educator in the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And this monthly program is part of our Hot Topic series, which stands for Human Origins Today. And I'm really pleased to introduce the speaker for today's Hot Topic program, Dr. Advait Jukar. Advait is a vertebrate paleobiologist. He received his BA in biology from Reed College in 2011 and an MS and PhD in environmental science and policy from George Mason University in 2018. After his PhD, Advait was awarded the Deep Time Peter Buck Fellowship at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, following which he moved to Yale as a Gaylord Donnelly postdoctoral associate, and he remains a research associate at the Smithsonian even now. Advait's research in the past has ranged from the phenotypic plasticity of frogs to the ecology of coral reef fish. He is currently working on the ecology and biogeography of herbivorous mammals and dinosaurs in the Indian Subcontinent and North America, and on the nature and consequences of the megafaunal extinction. In addition to being a researcher, Advait is a science educator and communicator and has helped develop on-site and digital educational activities for the museum. So just before we get started, I'll talk a little bit about logistics of today's program. As soon as Advait starts his presentation and shares his screen, I will turn off my video and microphone, and I will go behind the scenes and start looking at the questions. So we cannot see you and hear you. This is a webinar format. You can see either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what device you're on. There's a little speech bubble Q&A area. That's where you can type in questions for Advait. During the presentation, I will answer any questions that I am able to answer, but we will save the bulk of the questions to at the end of the presentation, and then Advait and I will both come on screen and I'll be reading out the questions that we get in that Q&A section. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm Briana Pobiner from the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, and this is our monthly Hot Topic event on Did Humans Cause Pleistocene Megafaunal Extinctions? All right, so Advait, if you're ready to share your screen, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Briana. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking about the megafaunal extinctions and try to figure out if we had anything to do with their demise. Before I start talking about these extinct animals, though, I'm going to talk a bit about where we are in space and time. The period where these extinctions take place is called the Quaternary, which includes the Pleistocene and the Holocene. The Holocene is where we live. And these extinctions take place in the last 50,000 years of the Quaternary, which includes the latest part of the Pleistocene and all of the Holocene. Climatically, this is a very dynamic period of time characterized by multiple glacial and interglacial periods. What we commonly call the Ice Age is actually the last glacial period. We live in the Holocene interglacial here, but in addition to this Ice Age, there have been several Ice Ages in the Pleistocene, all increasing in intensity as we move forward through time and in the 2.5 million year history of this period. An interglacial world looked very much like our world today. However, the glacial world looked very different. When you had a glacial period, a lot of water was locked up in these massive ice sheets, which were formed on the North American and Eurasian continents, and to some extent in Australia and South America. Because so much water was locked up in these ice sheets, sea levels were a lot lower and there was a lot more land exposed. For example, there was a coastal plain which extended about 200 miles off the east coast of North America. And the islands of Southeast Asia were all fused in this landmass called Sundaland. Sri Lanka, again, was connected to India. So a fairly different world. Biomes were very different. But let's get back to the extinction. This extinction has fascinated people since the days of Darwin and Wallace. Wallace famously pointed out in 1876 that we live in a zoologically impoverished world from which the hugest, fiercest, and strangest forms have recently disappeared. And he wasn't actually exaggerating, because it wasn't that long ago, only about 50,000 years ago, that large species, especially large mammals, lived everywhere on the planet. You had animals like giant mammoths and mastodons, horses and saber-toothed cats in North America. You had elephant relatives, these strange rhino-like toxodons, armadillo-like glyptodons, and giant ground sloths in South America. Australia had these rhino-sized wombat relatives called diprotodon and a marsupial lion, Thylacoleo. Northern Eurasia had the woolly rhino, cave bears, giant deer, and the woolly mammoth. Even Africa, which still has a lot of megafauna today, had even more in the late Pleistocene. You had the long-horned buffalo, Cincerus antiquus, and the extinct wildebeest, Rusingorix. Southeast Asia had a giant tapir and stegodon, and even the Indian subcontinent had a now extinct hippo and a giant proboscidean called Paleoloxodon. The most recent extinctions were seen on the oceanic islands, where Madagascar lost the giant human-sized lemur and the elephant bird. New Zealand lost the moa, and giant ground sloths go extinct in the Caribbean. And what this has resulted in is a pattern of megafauna today, where most of them are found in Africa and parts of South and Southeast Asia. So what caused these extinctions, and why do we have this curious pattern of megafauna today? Well, to begin to understand this, we need to understand the characteristics of this extinction. How do we define it? First of all, it's called a megafaunal extinction, and the word megafauna means large animal. It's called this because large species preferentially go extinct in the last 50,000 years. This is called a large size bias. So the graph that you're seeing here is the frequency distribution of the body weights of land mammals. What you can see here is that most land mammals are small, between shrews, things that weigh about 100 grams. There are very, very few mammals which weigh more than a ton. But if you look at the black bars here, those are the mammals which go extinct in the late Quaternary. All of those are very large. And if we blow this up, you can get a sense of just how big they were. The median size, or the size of, let's say, a mammal in the middle here, was about 300 pounds. So this is a very, very large animal. And most of them that went extinct weighed more than 50 kilograms, or about 100 pounds. The extinctions varied in magnitude across the world. For example, the Americas, Japan, Australia, and Madagascar lost between 70 to 100% of mammals weighing more than 50 kilograms. Western Europe lost only 16 species, but that represents about 55% of its large mammals. Northern Africa lost about 30% of its large mammal fauna. The lowest extinctions were seen in South Asia, South Africa, and East Africa, where you only see anywhere between 10 and 15% extinctions. And this is what has resulted in that. Places which had fewer extinctions have a lot more living megafauna. Places that had a lot of extinctions have very, very few megafauna today. The extinctions were also asynchronous. What this means is that their timing was staggered over the last 50,000 years. Most of them occurred in the late Pleistocene, but a few extended into the Holocene. For example, the extinctions in Africa were kind of smeared from about 60,000 years to 5,000 years ago. The Australian extinction started sometime after 60,000 years and continued on until about 35,000 years. Northern Europe and Siberia experienced 3 pulses of extinctions. The Indian subcontinent saw an extinction start at about 30,000 years and extend up to about 8,000 years. South America saw extinction start about 20,000 years and go into the earliest part of the Holocene. North America had extinctions from about 15,000 to 12,000 years, and the oceanic islands all had extinctions which occurred in the last 1,000 years. Another curious characteristic of these extinctions is that they all occur after Homo sapiens, or our species, leaves Africa. Our species evolves in Africa sometime between 300 and 200,000 years ago, and leaves Africa and shows up in parts of Eurasia by about 100,000 years, and then is firmly established in Eurasia between 60 and 45,000 years. Between 65 and 50,000 years, they spread down to Australia. And in this part of the world, the extinctions all take place after people show up. They reach the Bering Land Bridge sometime between 30 and 25,000 years ago and move south of the ice into the Americas, for sure by about 14 to 15,000 years, but some sites suggest that people may have been here even before that. And again, here in the Americas, the extinctions post-date the arrival of people. People reach the oceanic islands like Madagascar much later on, and again, the extinctions take place after, and the same trends are seen in New Zealand. The causes of these extinctions have been heavily debated. Four main hypotheses have been proposed: anthropogenic activities, which includes things like hunting or landscape change by people; climate or environmental change because of the fluctuations between glacial and interglacial cycles and the short-term cold and warm spells in between; an extraterrestrial impact; and a hyper disease. There isn't much evidence for an impact or a hyper disease causing this extinction. So today we're going to focus on the two major causes: anthropogenic activities and climate and environmental change. But to figure out which of these two causes was the major factor behind the extinctions, we need to see if any of these causes explains the size bias, the asynchronicity, and the variable magnitude. So let's look at the large size bias. We know that the extinct species were all larger than the survivors. Most of the surviving mammals today are relatively small, and even within groups of mammals which go extinct, for example, deer, the biggest ones tend to go extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. The way to figure out if this size bias is unique or not is to see if the odds that a species goes extinct is large, is high. Turns out that these high odds are only seen after about 100,000 years. In the rest of the time in the Cenozoic, in the last 66 million years of mammal evolution, there isn't a size bias towards large size species. What this means is that at any point in time between about 66 million years to about 100,000 years, large and small species have an equal chance of going extinct. However, it's only after about 100,000 years that large size species preferentially go extinct. What this means is that there's probably a strong argument to be made for humans, because it's only after about 100,000 years that people spread out on the landscape, but climate has changed by several orders of magnitude and in a variety of ways over the last 66 million years, and we just don't have any evidence of this size biased extinction. Let's look at asynchronicity, or the staggered nature of these extinctions. The squiggly line that you're seeing up on top is the Greenland ice core oxygen isotope curve, which is a proxy for global temperature, at least in the northern hemisphere. Up here is where it's warm in the Holocene, which is where we live. Down here are the cold glacials. In this period of time, there are three particularly cold periods: the last glacial maximum, Heinrich Event 1, which gets particularly cold and dry in South and Southeast Asia, and the Younger Dryas, which is the third cold snap. And it seems like some of these extinctions correspond to these periods of climate change, but a lot of extinctions don't. And if you look at the overall climate curve, there are a lot of squiggles on this line, suggesting that climate had fluctuated quite a bit over the last 60,000 years. However, what seems to correlate fairly well with this pattern of extinction is the arrival of humans. People have been there in Africa for a long time, but then people show up on the rest of the continents right when the extinctions start to take place. Moreover, most of the species which go extinct in the last 50,000 years had survived several periods of glaciation and interglacials. What this suggests is that these animals were adapted to deal with these climate changes. It's only in the last 50,000 years that something is different, and I would argue that the only different thing here is people. Based on this, I would say that there's a fairly strong argument to be made for people for this extinction, not so much for climate. Let's take a look at the variable magnitude. You would expect, if people are causing this extinction, that places where people have lived for the longest time to have more extinctions than places where people have been there for the fewest amount of time, right? Or for the least amount of time. We know that people have been there in Africa and in Eurasia for at least 100,000 years, if not more. But the pattern of the extinction is almost the opposite. Places where humans evolved and where Homo sapiens have lived for a long time show few extinctions and the persistence of a lot of large species, whereas places where Homo sapiens were the newest species of hominin show higher magnitudes of extinction, which is kind of weird. And so based on just this, it's a fairly weak argument that humans were causing the extinction, because you would expect more extinctions to take place in Africa and South Asia. Climate change also doesn't quite explain this, because there's no reason why the Americas would be affected so much more than Eurasia to cause the dramatic changes in extinction magnitude. But I have an asterisk there. I have an asterisk there because if you look at this figure again, what you'll notice is that most of these large animals are present in places where Homo sapiens weren't the only hominin. What this means is that Africa was the cradle of humankind. Our ancestry goes back about 6 million years. And it's been hypothesized that because we evolved in Africa, the lineages of these megafauna, which evolved alongside us, had evolved strategies to deal with whatever people are doing on the landscape. This is called the co-evolution model for species persistence. And turns out that South Asia shows similar patterns as well. And it shows that because there were actually several species of hominin outside of Africa after about 2 million years. We have evidence of Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and even Denisovans outside Africa. Homo erectus, or an erectus-like hominin, leaves Africa sometime around 2 million years and then spreads all the way down to Southeast Asia. And we have either fossils or tools all the way into the southernmost parts of Europe. Homo heidelbergensis is found in parts of Africa and in Europe, and then in this very famous site in Germany called Schöningen. We have evidence of spears that were made by Homo heidelbergensis, which is suggestive of its hunting ability. Neanderthals and Denisovans were again fairly widespread across much of Eurasia. Even in India, which doesn't have a particularly good fossil record, has almost continuous hominin occupation from about 1.7 million years all the way up to the present. We have an almost continuous stone tool record from there. What all of this suggests is that in all of these places, hominins have been evolving alongside all of these different species, and this may have led to the persistence. So if we look at the extinction magnitude and compare it to the different parts of the world and the different records of hominins, what we see is that Africa has several species of hominins, and the coexistence goes back about 6 million years. And we only see between 10 and 15% extinction. Eurasia is kind of weird. We see a 55% extinction in Western Europe, but not so much elsewhere, because if you look at the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, we only see about a 15% megafaunal extinction. Parts of the world where humans were the only species, like Australia, South America, and North America, we see extremely high magnitudes of the megafaunal extinction. Again, this suggests that the amount of time that these fauna were co-evolving with hominins and the number of hominins they co-evolved with is a predictor of megafaunal persistence. So we know that humans probably had a major role to play in this extinction. But what about climate? Does this vindicate climate change completely? Well, I would say no. And the reason I say that is because Climate change is known to fragment species ranges and is known to cause population declines. As soon as the climate changes, a species has to move to its preferred climate. What this graph, what these images here are showing is the range shift of mammoths in Eurasia. When it's warm, in the last interglacial maximum, mammoths were found up north at the edge of the Arctic in these isolated dark pockets here. But when it becomes cold, there's a lot more environment for them to occupy. It's a lot more suitable for them. And so when it's cold and the mammoth steppe expands, these species can then move down. So what I'm trying to argue here is that climate change can fragment populations. It can decrease the size of a population, thereby decreasing the resilience of a species to a new threat or a new predator on the landscape, like Homo sapiens. Furthermore, the biology of being big also makes these animals less resilient when there is an introduced species like Homo sapiens, and when a lot of climate change is taking place. Big animals reproduce very slowly. There are long gestation, they have long gestation times. What this means is that they stay pregnant for a long time. Elephants stay pregnant for about 2 years. There are long interbirth intervals. This means is that it takes a long time between individual births. It can be almost 6 years in an elephant. They produce small litters. For the most part, large animals will only produce one offspring. And the age to sexual maturity tends to be delayed, which means that it takes a lot longer for these animals to get to a breeding age. All these factors combined in conjunction with changing climates means that these populations are in a state of flux when their preferred climate doesn't exist. And when you add humans to the mix, it's a recipe for extinction. Climate change alone doesn't seem to be able to cause this, but we need humans to explain these extinctions. These hypotheses by themselves are unicausal, but we know that extinctions are seldom unicausal. Maybe we need to go away from these single mechanism questions and start asking the question of, in the absence of humans, would you expect the same pattern and magnitude of the megafaunal extinction? There's a lot of evidence for it, especially from oceanic islands where humans came in quite late. We don't see the extinctions until people show up. And I would probably argue that newer models and simulations would probably be able to show that climate change alone would not produce the same magnitude, the same size bias, and the same asynchronicity that a human-caused extinction would produce. With that, thank you so much for having me and for listening to me talk about one of my favorite topics. And if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them.
Fantastic, Advait. Thank you for that really fascinating talk. And we do have a bunch of questions coming in. So I will start with actually the first question that came in, which I think is a great one. And this is from Niels. How did mammals become so large in the first place?
That's a very good question. There seems to be a general so dinosaurs go extinct, at least the non-avian dinosaurs go extinct about 66 million years ago. There's a lot of open ecological space for mammals to then occupy. Back in the Mesozoic, dinosaurs had occupied this large size class, but now that they were extinct, there was a lot of opportunity for mammals to get bigger. Sometimes mammals get big because they want to avoid predation, in which case they get big, and once you get big, it's kind of hard for you to get eaten. Sometimes animals get big in colder places because it's easier for a large animal to stay warm. There are also general evolutionary trends whereby groups of species tend to get larger over time, which is also a trend that we see in mammals.
So quick question from Jennifer. What was the fossil that you were laying next to at the end of the slideshow?
That was a large skull of a yet unnamed species of Paleoloxodon, which is a giant elephant that I'm working on. It was found in Kashmir, and it probably dates from about 300 to 400,000 years ago. What's cool about this specimen is that we found stone tools alongside that elephant, suggesting that it was either being butchered or people had hunted it.
Interesting. Looking forward to hearing more about that at
Yeah.
some point. So here's a few people have typed in this question in a similar way. The first one was Sophie. Are there any extinctions of marine megafauna that match the terrestrial ones in the various locations, or did the marine animals escape these extinctions? And I think the same question was asked by Nona. Would you please address oceanic megafauna extinctions as well, like megalodon, for example?
Sure. Megalodon goes extinct before humans had even evolved, or I guess our species had even evolved. Megalodon goes extinct at least 5 million years ago, if not before that. So despite what the Discovery Channel tells you, there is no megalodon alive today. The curious thing about these extinctions is that they only occur on land. We don't actually see any marine megafaunal extinctions until the extinction of the stellar sea cow, which we know was hunted to extinction. So again, the only sea mammal which goes extinct was killed off by us.
Okay, good to know. A couple people have asked whether you think Neanderthals played a part in these extinctions. Meg asked this, a few other people did.
It's possible that Neanderthals had also affected the size of these populations in Eurasia. The jury is still out as to whether Neanderthals had any impact. A way to test this would be to extend the fossil record of these mammals back about 800,000 years ago and see if we see similar extinction events when Neanderthals were fairly active in Europe. So far, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that, which indicates that it's probably our species that's causing the same magnitude of extinction.
So here's an interesting question from Betsy. Don't we see today that animals learn in a couple generations to fear and avoid humans when they arrive in an ecosystem?
Yes, that is probably true. However, any ecosystem that we have today has been occupied by humans for a long time, for at least 20,000 years. So these animals are not as naive to humans as we think they are. What we're seeing here is an evolutionary process which is what co-evolution is. But we also need to know that a lot of these animals are not uniformly distributed across the landscape. You know, animal species tend to be clumped on the landscape. They don't live everywhere. And it's also possible that when the climate changes, they get forced into smaller and smaller habitats. And it's not hard for people to come, and even with a low amount of hunting pressure, to get the populations from a replacement rate of 2 to a fertility rate of about 1.9, in which case it will eventually collapse.
So it doesn't take a lot in
It doesn't take a lot. We don't have to kill everything.
Yeah.
We just have to kill enough so that the populations don't recover.
Okay, yeah. So here's a question about the Americas from Buzz. A common argument against the overkill hypothesis in the Americas is that there are relatively few archaeological sites with now extinct megafaunal remains, but many extant species remains. How do you think this argument factors into this narrative? Is this just a massive example of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence?
So that's a great question. It's this problem that a lot of people have been wrestling with. If you think about kill sites are rare to begin with. For an animal to enter into the fossil record, it also has to die in a particular place. And even when you have kill sites or sites where you have tools and other faunal remains, it's actually very rare to find evidence of cut mark bones or any kills. Overall, these are rare events to fossilize, but the fact that we even have fossilized remains of them suggests that they were happening. Again, humans didn't have to kill everything off. We just have to kill off a few individuals occasionally in small stressed out populations. We know the American extinctions take place during a period of climate change. A paper just came out yesterday which talked about how population declines correlate fairly well with the climate change seen North America. So if you have stressed out populations, it doesn't take a lot of hunting pressure to wipe them out.
So here's a question along those lines, in a sense, and this may be a hard one to answer. Patrick asks, how large would human populations have to be to drive multiple large animals to extinction? And someone had asked earlier, what was the human population at 15,000 years ago? And did this extinction take place over thousands of years?
We don't actually know what the human population was like 1,000 years ago. People try and estimate that by the number of radiocarbon dates. I'm still not convinced whether the number of radiocarbon dates is a good estimate of population size or population density. Ancient DNA can offer clues as to what the effective population size was, but we'd have to extract that from a 15,000-year-old human that we'd find in North America, to be sure. A lot of the extinctions do take place after or in a several thousand-year period of time. There was this idea called blitzkrieg, which a famous geologist and paleontologist, Paul Martin, came up with. But most of us don't take that argument seriously anymore. We now know that there is a substantial time lag between the first arrival of people and the extinction of these animals. And here's another note. When you see the first arrival of humans, that's not the actual first arrival. That's the first evidence in the fossil record. The first arrival was probably much before that. And the same thing goes with the last appearance of an extinct species in the fossil record. That's not the true extinction time, because we'll never find the last individual. The last individual probably lived much later than that.
That's a good reminder. So I have two similar questions. One from David: in what ways would humans cause extinction? Hunting for sure, but are there other ways? And Taylor asked, is there any evidence explaining why these extinctions happen once humans came, besides the use of hunting and gathering?
So those are both great questions. Humans tend to also alter the landscape. We tend to change fire regimes. We tend to suppress fire. We also tend to modify the landscape for our purposes. Humans are a very weird predator. Most predators are far less common than their prey. We see this with lions and tigers, leopards. There are far fewer of them than there are prey species. And they tend to only go after very specific kinds of prey. Humans are weird because we tend to reproduce quite a bit, and we tend to go after a wide variety of prey species. I don't think there's been a primate predator ever in sort of the history of primate evolution, which is quite like us. And I don't think big cats or dogs use similar strategies that we use to hunt.
That's really something for me to think about. Thank you. I hadn't thought about the uniqueness of humans as predators.
Yeah.
So here's a question that's kind of touched on a few things you just mentioned from Steve. The reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone brought dramatic and unexpected changes to flora and ecosystems. How do landscapes and ecosystems change with the extinction of megafauna?
Yeah, so we actually do see quite a bit of ecological change after the extinction of the megafauna. We did a couple of studies in the evolution of terrestrial ecosystems research group at the Smithsonian, where we showed that the patterns of species co-occurrence, that means which species co-occur together, changes after the megafaunal extinction. That means whatever ecological rules are driving species to coexist tend to break down after big species go extinct. And the same thing applies to how body size structures ecosystems. We know that body size was a big factor in structuring ecosystems before the extinction, but after the extinction of big things, body size just becomes irrelevant for these patterns of co-occurrence.
So here's an interesting question from Antoine. The African mammals from the Middle Pleistocene to the Late Pleistocene are not that well known. Could the low percentage of extinction in Africa be partly explained by this relative lack of data from the period from 800 to about 100,000 years ago?
Yeah, it could definitely be explained by that. There have been a couple of studies to explain this long-term decline in African mammals, and it seems to be this generalized trend. But I think we have a similar problem in South Asia as well, where we just don't have a good fossil record between 800,000 years and about 100,000 years ago. It's very conceivable that there was a similar extinction then, but we just don't have a lot of evidence from this part of the world to test that.
So this is a question perfectly following up on that from Tosabanta. In South Asia, especially in India, there are good numbers of Pleistocene large mammal fauna have been recorded, but the findings of large mammal fauna with stone tools are scarce. Why is this kind of evidence not common?
I just don't think we've looked hard enough in South Asia. If you compare the actual number of sites in South Asia to a better sample part of the world like North America, we are quite lacking in the number of sites with fauna and lithics. Also, lithics and fauna sometimes just don't preserve in the same place. And Briana, you'd be able to speak more on this from the African record, where there are sites where you get tools, but then there are sites where you only get bones. It's not all that common to find them in the same place.
Yeah, absolutely. I just worked with some colleagues, including your postdoc supervisor, Jessica Thompson, on a book chapter that was trying to assemble all this data for where do we see stone tools in Africa, where do we see fauna, and are they correlated? And the bottom line is not always. So here's an interesting question from Mary Ray. What about the possibility of diseases that jumped from humans to animals and vice versa?
Yeah, sure. This was a hypothesis that was proposed by Ross McPhee, who's a paleontologist at the American Museum. It's called the hyperdisease hypothesis. So far, we don't have any evidence of a disease that can jump several orders of mammals and only affect large species in a way to cause the same pattern and asynchronity of the extinction. And the difference in magnitude. It also doesn't benefit a virus to kill off its host completely. It wouldn't be a very good virus if it did that. We just don't have a lot of known viruses which can do that. It's possible that a virus may have jumped from a person to one or a handful of closely related species and may have driven them extinct if they lived in small enough populations, but it probably wouldn't have caused the same pattern that we see.
So here's a question from Randy, who says he's a geologist in Texas. How did the coevolution and distribution of grasses, or maybe I would add other types of plants, impact the types and distributions of megafauna?
Yeah, so in the glacial period, we have a lot of grasslands all over the world. You have the Mammoth Steppe, which goes all across from Eurasia into Alaska and the Yukon. And this was a giant grassland, which does tend to correlate with animals like mammoths and the woolly rhino. When it gets warmer, the steppe tends to shrink and gets replaced by forests. The steppe was probably also made possible by these megafauna because the megafauna tend to plow out snow and it promotes growth. Grasslands also survive in these drier conditions because of fire regime. So it's a synergistic system that's keeping these grasslands around. And we see this in Africa. Elephants knock down trees. If you lose elephants, trees come back on the savanna.
Absolutely. Here's a question from Dominique. Great talk, thank you. What's the evidence that smaller animals did not go extinct too? It is already difficult to find fossils of large animals. I would guess it's even harder for small animals.
So small animals and large animals preserve in different places. You oftentimes find small animals in things like middens or in caves. Based on the small animal record from North America, which is the best sampled of the continents, we see, I think, 4 smaller species going extinct. And by small animals, I mean rodent-sized animals. For the most part, they're big. And even in better sampled sites in Europe, we just don't have any small mammal extinctions. We currently don't have any small mammal sites, or I guess widespread small mammal sites in South Asia. But from this one cave site in South India, which is being fairly well sampled, we don't see any small mammal extinctions.
Okay. So there does seem to be a size bias.
There does seem to be a size bias. And to get the same magnitude, you would have to lose a lot of small species, and there would have to be a lot of small unknown species to get sort of a 50% large and 50% small extinction.
Yeah, good point. So I have two questions from Gopesh. What do you think about factors like size of population in the animals as well as humans, and intensity or availability of ecological resources? And continuation to the last question, is it possible late persistence of megafauna in South Asia is due to rich and constant resources, which created sympatric niches for megafauna and humans?
Yeah, no, totally. South Asia, the climate change experience in South Asia doesn't seem to be as extreme as the climate change experience in northern parts of the world. For example, Britain has a distinct interglacial fauna and a distinct glacial fauna. The interglacial fauna in Britain includes animals like hippos, the same hippos which are found in Africa today. They made their way all the way up to Germany and Britain, but once it gets cold, these environments are occupied by bison and mammoths. South Asia tends to have a high diversity of environments and a lot of refugia, which may have offered some sanctuary to these extinct species for sure. Yeah.
So here's an interesting question from Molly. Whoops, it moved for a second. Is there any evidence of megafaunal domestication by early humans?
For sure, yeah. So if you've ever eaten a hamburger that is derived from a domesticated megafauna, there are two species of wild cattle. There's Bos primigenius, or the European auroch, and you have Bos pneumaticus, which is the Indian auroch. And we have evidence for domestication of both of those kinds of wild cattle into the modern taurine cattle in Europe and the modern zebu cattle in South Asia. Wild boar, it's a megafaunal pig, was domesticated into domesticated pigs. Domestication seems to be an old world phenomenon for the most part. The only two examples of domestication in the New World are in camels. South America has now 4 kinds of camels. You've got llama, guanaco, vicuña, and alpaca. Llama and alpaca are domesticated forms of guanaco and vicuña.
Okay, thanks. Here's a great question, and I don't know how, it would be interesting to think about how to answer this. This is a question from Josie. Did humans prefer large prey, or were large prey more vulnerable?
It's a really hard question to answer. Were large prey more vulnerable? They were at a higher risk of extinction because of their biology when the climate wasn't suitable to them, but only when people were predators. It's easier to see large game on the landscape. It's probably easier to catch large game. It's probably more energy efficient to take down a bison or a mammoth than it is to go after about 100 rabbits to feed your tribe. It's probably a combination of those two.
Here's another good question that I think it might be challenging to answer. Maybe thinking about it from an animal perspective, but Betsy asks, would early North Americans have noticed that they were killing off their big animal food source and decide they better ration their hunting?
Unclear, and something that we can never know. Hominins back then, as far as we can tell, were trying to survive on a fairly harsh, unknown landscape, and they were doing what they did best, which is get resources to support growing populations. I'm not sure if anyone had any concept of extinction or population decline to the point where species will go extinct, but I'm pretty sure hunter-gatherers know when a population of a particular species is going away. There were so many large species back then that it was probably easy for these hunters to switch prey items as they went along.
Nice. Here's a question from Nupur, and I think it touches on some things you addressed in your presentation, but has an additional question. What is the reason behind the low magnitude of megafaunal extinction in the Indian subcontinent compared to other continents? And what is your take on ostrich extinction in India?
Yeah, so I think that the low magnitude in the Indian subcontinent is caused by a few things. One is co-evolution with multiple species of hominin for about 2 million years. So the native fauna was probably adapted to whatever people were doing there. Two, a lot of these species which survive had large geographic distributions. We know that Asian elephants lived at one point from Turkey all the way into Southeast Asia. We also know that Asian elephants occupied glacial refugia in Sri Lanka and in Southeast Asia, and may have come back into the Indian subcontinent once things were more favorable for them. So I think it's the availability of refugia, its co-evolution with people, and large geographic distributions that allowed them to survive.
Excellent, thank you. And what about ostriches?
Ostriches, I think, probably experienced the same fate as the other big birds on the oceanic islands. People probably went after their eggs, and once you start killing off offspring, it's not that hard for a population of large birds to collapse.
Here's a question from Jay, when you were just speaking about glacial things. Can you talk about rewilding of megafauna in Arctic or subarctic regions that might contribute to stabilizing climate warming?
Yeah, I've thought about this issue quite a bit. There's an ongoing effort in Siberia called Pleistocene Park. It's been spearheaded by Sergei Zimov, who's this crazy Russian paleoecologist trying to save the mammoth steppe. If you want to recreate the mammoth steppe, you need it to not snow as much. It snows a lot in an interglacial because it's warmer. It didn't snow a lot in a glacial because a lot of water was locked up in ice sheets. So in general, you're just going to get a lot more precipitation now. If you want megafauna like mammoths or bison or whatever to clear out the snow, you will need millions and millions of individuals out on the steppe there. We just don't have that many of them around. And in order for a slowly reproducing organism to breed and produce that many offspring, it'll just take too long. I think we have better proximate ways of dealing with climate change that we should probably stick with. I think Pleistocene Park is an interesting idea about how rewilding can change the ecosystem, which we've known for a long time. I just don't think it can solve the climate crisis.
Agreed. So I'm going to ask you two questions from the same person, and I would say you can pick one or answer both. So LT asks, would you think this past pattern of hunting targeting large size animals foresees possible extinctions of the remaining megafauna still living now? Separate question, would rainforest refugia play a role in lower extinction events in South and Southeast Asia?
Second question, absolutely. And we've seen this from genetic evidence that rainforest refugia probably allowed large mammals to persist. We know from some evidence in Sri Lanka that humans who inhabited rainforests probably went after smaller game than large game. So maybe there was a hunting preference difference in people who lived on the plains versus people who lived in the forests. Can you repeat the first question again?
Yes, definitely. So would you think the past pattern of hunting targeting large size animals sees possible extinctions of the remaining megafauna?
Yeah, for sure. If we look at the threatened and endangered list, most of the big species which are threatened with extinction tend to be the ones which we poach, things like rhino and elephant and lion. We are still causing this extinction. And a lot of the factors like human hunting, habitat change, habitat fragmentation, and climate change have all intensified. So if we keep going the way that we've been going for the last 200 years, we're going to see more extinctions to the point where the largest land mammal will be a cow. And
that's very sad thought.
It's not a nice future to live in.
Yeah. So Ruben asks, what kind of megafauna strategies were adapted in Africa and Southeast Asia in a coevolution model that were not adapted or I guess used in areas like Australia and the Americas? Are there any theorized examples?
We don't quite know that yet. It's a hard it's a hard problem to kind of test directly because we just don't, behavior doesn't preserve well in the fossil record. So it's kind of hard to figure out what these animals were actually doing on the landscape to avoid people. All we have to go by are these longer term patterns of survival in places where there are lots of hominins and extinction in places where there was only one hominin.
So here's a question about some of your favorite animals from Ibrahimul. Why did elephant species in the Indian subcontinent get reduced in the Quaternary?
Well, in the Quaternary, all right, so the Quaternary lasts 2.6 million years. In the Quaternary, this is the project that I'm working on now, there are 3 species of elephas. There's Elephas plantifrons, Elephas hysidricus, maybe Elephas platycephalus. I'm still trying to figure out if that's a valid species or not, and Elephas maximus. Maximus is derived probably from a hysidricus or hysidricus ancestor. The earlier species were more adapted to browsing environments. They had smaller crown teeth. It was probably environmental change over the long term that caused their extinction. In general, we have 3 proboscideans, which are elephant relatives, which live in the Indian subcontinent in the last 50,000 years. You have Asian elephants, you have stegodon, and you have paleoloxodon. Stegodon and paleoloxodon are massive animals. They're bigger than modern Asian elephants. It's possible that human hunting wiped them out, or at least contributed to wiping them out. It's also possible that they just could not access rainforest refugia during harsher periods of time like the modern Asian elephant could. And so any remaining fragmented populations were easy prey for people.
So these 2 questions are kind of similar to one you addressed already, but maybe it would be good to revisit. So Cynthia asked, what did our species do differently from Neanderthals that may have contributed to or caused these extinctions? And Chris asked, does the more primitive tool technology and by proxy hunting capabilities of early African hominids have an impact on the lower extinction rates seen in Africa?
Can't speak to the second part of the question. But based on South Asia, which is a record that I know better than most others, we know that the extinctions take place once you get a shift in tool technology to microliths. And microliths are these small blades and flakes, which are hypothesized to be projectile points. So hominids here were getting more sophisticated in their technology as their population started to grow. And it's possible that technological change by about 30,000 years contributed to the megafaunal extinction in South Asia. It's possible that more sophisticated blades and tools like Clovis points in North America contributed to the extinctions here.
Yeah, certainly it seems that projectile technology, being able to like get a lot further away from these dangerous animals, would have been really advantageous.
Yeah, Briana, can I just follow up on that question? Do you know when the atlatl came about? So the atlatl is a spear thrower, and we know that spears exist in Europe by about 800,000 years. So it's conceivable that they were there by then.
That's a good question, and I don't know when the earliest atlatls are from, but I think they're actually quite a bit later in time. My understanding is that the earliest spears are hypothesized based on their size and shape and weight to be thrusting spears instead of throwing spears. And then maybe like an atlatl lets you get even further away. It's kind of the next best thing to a bow and arrow in a sense. Good question though. So Meg asks, are the domesticated dogs that we see in our homes today part of the megafauna that survived this extinction?
Yes, because they're domesticated wolves, and wolves are megafauna, and therefore dogs are megafauna. Interestingly, we are megafauna as well, and we survived this extinction. If you weigh more than 50 kilograms on average as a species, you are megafauna.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Days when I'm not feeling very powerful, we are megafauna. So Michael asks, apart from fossils, what evidence supports the movement of hippos from a southern continent to northern Europe?
Apart from fossils?
I'm not sure what kind of evidence we might have apart from fossils, but.
So we know that the Sahara goes green every so often. It's because of the way our planet is oriented to the sun and changes in its orbit, whether depending on the wobble and the tilt and the shape of the orbit. There are periods of time when it rains a lot more in the Sahara, which means it gets green, and there are rivers and lakes. And these rivers and lakes probably flow through the Levant, and that's probably how these hippos ended up in parts of Europe. We think of hippos today as animals which like to live in warm places, But even today in an interglacial, which is not all that different from the last interglacial maximum when you found hippos in Germany and in Britain, it gets cold in the winter. So maybe we need to rethink climate tolerances of these large animals. You had water buffalo in Europe as well, and it gets cold in the winters. It doesn't stay warm like it does in parts of South Asia and Africa. So maybe these northern hippos, probably the same species, just had slightly different climate tolerances, or we just don't know enough about the climate tolerances of these species based on their present day distributions.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, we tend to use the, living relatives of extinct species and kind of wholesale pose their climate tolerances and predatory behaviors and things like that. So it's important to remember that there might be some variation in past species for sure.
Yeah, and we know that the Gulf Stream keeps Northern Europe warm, but it doesn't keep it as warm as East Africa. And we know that the hippos made it there, even in periods when the Thames would have frozen. So they were doing something that allowed them. Yeah.
Exactly. So here's a question from Siddharth. Has seismic and volcanic activity coinciding with an increase in human population been considered as a possible cause of megafaunal extinctions?
Yeah, so there was this idea that the Toba supereruption sometime around 74,000 years may have caused a bottleneck in human populations and some extinctions in Southeast Asia, but we have continuity of tool technologies through this eruption in South India, and all of the animals that we see in the latest part of the Pleistocene are present before and after the Toba supereruption. Toba probably killed off everything in its local vicinity, just like Krakatoa did when it blew up. I just don't. I can't think of any longer term consequences on the extinction from this volcano.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you answered a question that Susan had asked earlier, which is, do researchers see rebound of large mammals at 74,000 years ago when human population was significantly reduced? So thank you. Let's see. Here's another question from Antoine. You mentioned forest refugia. A few African unique species present in highlands like geladas or giant forest hogs are relics of genera that were widespread in the lowlands up to the late Pleistocene. Could those high altitude areas be refugia as well? And are there any similar examples in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, for sure. High altitude areas where you have more forests could definitely be refugia for these taxa. In terms of South and Southeast Asia, we think that some of these climate refugia existed in the Northeast, in sort of the sub-Himalayan basins out there, which tend to be fairly high elevation once you start going up to the mountains. And we know you get rhino and elephant all the way up there. It's possible that these places served as refugia in Southeast Asia. We just need to do so much more work in that region to understand what's going on. Most of the fossils come from peninsular India and parts of Sri Lanka. In Southeast Asia, most of them come from places like Java and Vietnam. But we need to do a lot more out there. I bet if you dredge on the Sunda Shelf, you'll probably pick up some fossils, because it's a fairly shallow sea out there connecting the Indonesian archipelago, and it used to once be land. I'm sure you can find lots of stuff out there, like they're finding in the Taiwan Strait. There are ships going through the strait, dredging, and they pull up, teeth and skulls of Paleoloxodon. People dredging in the North Sea and the English Channel pull up remains of woolly rhino and mammoth all the time.
Well, I say post-COVID, more exploration.
Yeah.
So we have two more questions. We only have a little bit of time. I want to ask a question from Josie concerning domestication. Why are few or no African megafauna domesticated?
I don't know. We know that the auroch, which lived in Africa as well, was domesticated, but the domestication center for that was probably the Middle East. The Somali ass was domesticated to a donkey. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I think there are certain characteristics that domesticated animals have, which means that they herd, they're fairly docile, and once you take over as the leader of the herd, it's sort of easy to control them, which is how I think cattle are a lot easier to be domesticated. Horses, I think, still have to be broken in after a while. Animals like elephants aren't true domesticates because they're just kind of kept with humans in a very sad state, in my opinion, but they aren't truly true domesticates like dogs or pigs or sheep or goats or cattle.
Yeah, I've heard jokingly when I've been doing research in Africa, it's because the megafauna there are just very crabby and not really amenable to human domestication.
It's like bison here, right? Bison are fairly crabby and not very amenable to being kept in a pen.
Exactly. So last question, and I love this question from Haley. What is one main thing you want us to take away from this presentation?
That even in low levels, humans are capable of causing this extinction in the face of climate change and biology. And the effects of this extinction were probably synergistic. And we should let go of these unicausal models. It's probably a combination of a number, but none of this would have been possible without people.
Thank you so much. We are just at 12:30, so we have to wrap up. I apologize for everybody's question that we weren't able to address. This presentation is being recorded, and so it will be posted on the National Museum of Natural History video webinar archives page within a few weeks. You can find it under the hot topics section. Look forward, everybody who registered today will get an email about next month's hot topic presentation, which will be on, I'm gonna look at my calendar really quickly, March 18th. So again, the third Thursday of the month, and that will be by Dr. Matt Tucheri, and he will be talking about Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of human evolution. So thank you very much again, Advait. Thank you everybody for coming today, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Briana.